Emotions are centered in the lower part of the brain.
How was insanity seen in the past? And is modern society making us mentally ill? From the dawn of man to current challenges, including the impact of social media and new psychedelic treatments.
Electroshock therapy may be recommended for other disorders.
Meet the experts in talks about all aspects of mental illness, from historical perspectives to contemporary challenges and future innovations. Welcome to Engelsberg's interview on mental health. And I welcome you, Andrew Scull.
Thank you. Very great pleasure to be here.
You're a professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego.
That's correct, yes. And have been for a rather long time.
You have. And we're here to talk about mental health and illnesses. Yes. So what is mental health to you?
It's really been a lifelong obsession that started back when I was in my early 20s. And I found it a subject so fascinating, so moving, so complex, that it's absorbed me ever since. There are just multiple ways in which one can approach that subject. And I think it's very important as a historian, and as I've broadened the temporal scope of what I work on, to be able to embrace not just the formal areas in which mental illness surfaces and in the modern era is treated, but to understand its much broader social and cultural and even political ramifications, the ways in which it spills over into religion, into art, into music, into architecture, into, as I say, politics, into literature of all kinds, and even when we move into the 20th century, into the movies as a new form of art, if you like. So it's an infinitely fascinating and in many ways frustrating topic to deal with, because it is such a poorly understood condition even now. And it creates an immense amount of suffering, and it's very important, I think, when we consider the history, not to downplay the effects. And the effects are ramifying. They obviously affect the mentally disturbed person most directly. But one of the features of mental illness is that its spillover effects on everybody else, the immediate family, the community in which somebody lives, and even the larger society in which we all function. So it's important to attend to all those different facets. You can't do that simultaneously, of course, but when you try to tell the narrative and to analyze what's happened over the course of history, beginning as early as recorded history begins in ancient Middle East, in ancient Greece, in ancient China and India, from then on, you can see certain themes that seem to persist. The ways in which madness is profoundly disturbing, difficult to comprehend, and complex in a whole variety of ways. And the struggles of people to make sense of people whose actions and emotions and behaviors seem to depart from the common sense universe that we all assume we share. You know, common sense has a double meaning. Common sense meaning the thing we all think we share of the world, and also common sense meaning the ways in which we ordinarily interact with the world in ways that aren't actively harmful to ourselves and people around us. And certain forms of mental illness, at least, produce both self-harm and sometimes harm that extends out into the broader society in powerful ways.
So as a historian, you go back to the earliest stages. So what was the common sense there in China or where we have written sources?
You know,
Mesopotamia.
Yes, I started out in the field working on the 19th century. And gradually I spread both forward and backward in time. When I wrote Madness in Civilization, which was my book that looks at things from the dawn of written records to the present. That involved a lot of thinking about those kinds of issues and how those societies confronted them. And there was a very strong tendency to appeal to supernatural accounts. We can see it with the Greeks, but we can also see it in the Jewish Bible and in the New Testament. Christ casting demons into the Gadarene swine, for example, or casting demons out of Mary Magdalene. So these were very much part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but there was also the persistence of Greek ideas and Roman ideas, and before the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was a competing narrative about mental illness that emerged out of the Hippocratic tradition and through Galen, which saw things as rooted in the body and in the four humors that were then considered to be the things that dictated people's illness and health. But when the Roman Empire collapsed in the West and urban civilization collapsed with it and literacy declined and the literature from the Greek and Roman physicians essentially evaporated. Fortunately, that tradition survived in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, not always with Arab physicians, but sometimes with Jewish and Christian physicians. And it gradually reemerged into the Western world in the 11th and 12th centuries. And there is a long period where medical and religious interpretations of mental health uneasily coexist. The priests want to claim dominion, the medical men accept, and they are mostly men, accept that some conditions may indeed be of a divine or devilish origin. But over time, those two universes begin to change the dynamics, and more, and certainly by the time we reach the 18th century, at least among the educated classes, the medical notion of madness is coming to the fore, and people are searching for naturalistic accounts of where mental disturbance comes from and how it might possibly be treated.
So if we go back to the religious part of it, so
yes.
what was the treatments then?
Well, within the Catholic tradition, drawing upon Christ's experience casting out demons, exorcism became a fairly considerable part of things. And the Protestants' response was to pray.
Yeah.
Not to exercise, but to the power of prayer. On the other hand, there's growing resistance to those things among the more educated, and a sense that they're a kind of superstitious approach to things that needs to be superseded. So one of the earliest manifestations of that, we see in the 18th century, a lot of discoveries that involve invisible forces, Newton and gravity, for example, work on magnetism, work on electricity. So the notion of invisible forces, which previously had been supernatural, now becomes potentially natural. And the most famous exponent of that in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and a little bit beyond, is an Austrian physician named Mesmer. Yes. And Mesmer's name, of course, survives in contemporary parlance through mesmerism, the idea that people's mental state can be influenced somehow. Mesmer thought what he discovered was a new invisible substance called animal magnetism, a fluid that went through the body as the nerves go through the body. So he did that in Vienna and claimed to cure both physical and mental troubles. But there was a scandal involving a young blind pianist And under Mesmer's influence, she recovered her sight. So we would think of as a psychosomatic blindness now. But the problem was twofold. First, there were rumors that there was a sexual affair going on between the two of them. Secondly, once she was no longer a blind pianist, she wasn't quite the prodigy that she had been. After Mesmer fled because the scandal became too great, she regained her blindness rather than regaining her sight. And she re-enters the story a little later because Mesmer goes to Paris, pre-revolutionary Paris, attracts the great and the good, the aristocracy, both male and female, who attend these seances, and he makes a great deal of money. And
it's a show.
It's a show.
Yeah.
And it's a show that is attracting very high-ticket patrons. And so the regular physicians are furious at this loss of income and at this outstart, from abroad who's capturing their patients. And so they eventually secure a commission set up by the king to examine Mesmer's doctrines and his claims to have discovered this new fluid.
And some famous names in that commission, too.
Perhaps the most famous among us Americans is Benjamin Franklin, who was then the ambassador to Paris, but also someone named Guillotin.
Yeah, exactly.
Who invents the guillotine a bit later. And of course, the king who set up that encounters the guillotine in a rather unpleasant manner just a few years later. So the commission reports it does a great deal of rather clever experiments to see whether there's something to this, and announces that no, it's a fraud, that it's suggestion, it's not, there's no magnetic fluid involved. And
quite scientific, right?
Yes, quite a clever attempt to really uncover sort of what we might think as early controlled trials to see whether all this stuff really works. And then another thing happens. The blind pianist comes from Vienna to play concerts in Paris, and the scandal about their potential affair erupts all over again, and Mesmer flees. And mesmerism falls into disrepute, and mainstream medicine simply rejects it. But it persists in popular culture, and mesmeric entrepreneurs go around putting it on display, and that's how it then morphs into something new. In the early 1840s, a rather prominent Scottish surgeon named James Baird attends one of these seances, and he goes in an extreme skeptic, thinks this is going to be a ridiculous thing.
Because it is.
Yes. But he's invited up onto the platform to examine a couple of mesmerized patients. And what he discovers is they can't open their eyes, they can't feel. It sort of is anesthetized them. And so he says, well, this notion of magnetic fluid is really silly. But the phenomenon that is here is somewhat real, and I've got to investigate what it is. And what he discovers is a technique that comes to be called hypnotism. It's not his first term for it, but it's the one that becomes popular. And because he rejects the magnetic fluid idea, his appropriation of Mesmer's work is not quite as easily discredited and acquires a certain following, but is still quite controversial until the leading neurologist of the age, Jean-Martin Charcot, who runs large wards at the Salpêtrière hospital in Paris, adopts hypnosis. And Charcot has turned his attention to hysteria, a very mysterious disorder that mimics all kinds of things and has very dramatic physical symptoms. And he starts employing hysteria in public lectures that he delivers once a week. So this attracts people from all over the world, neurologists who come to study. And one of the people who shows up in the late 1880s is none other than Sigmund Freud.
Exactly. Who
comes from Vienna. Of course, Freud's basic training as a physician was as a neurologist. He's only there for a few months. But one of the things he does that brings the great man's favor is to promise to translate his work into German, even though Freud's French is probably about as good as mine these days. I used to be fairly fluent, but from disuse, it's pretty bad now. So anyway, Freud goes back to Vienna armed with these new theories and goes to the leading lights of the Viennese medical profession and says, look at this great discovery. And they look at him and say, that's just fraudulent nonsense. We don't want anything to do with it. So his academic prospects are diminishing. He goes back into private practice. He gets a lot of his patients from one of his more senior colleagues, Joseph Breuer, who has a very large practice, particularly among the Jewish haute bourgeoisie. And the two of them eventually, in the mid-1890s, publish a very famous book called Studies on Hysteria. And one of the major cases in that book is sort of often seen as the figure, the foundational figure for psychoanalysis. And then Breuer says to him, look, I'm no longer interested in hysteria. And Freud says, all right, well, you go your way, I'll go mine. And it's at that point that Freud starts to develop his psychological theories of the origins of mental disorder. Now, initially, there's a famous essay that he never manages to complete where he wants to provide a physiological account of mental illness, but he abandons that project for a scientific psychology and goes in the direction of seeing things in terms of murdered memories, or half-murdered memories, suppressed emotions and so on, and the ways those then get translated into bodily symptoms and mental symptoms as well. But Freud, during his lifetime, is very much a minority taste. Most physicians resist the idea that illnesses can be treated through talk. And added to that is Freud's emphasis on the sexual origins of things, which for many prudish people strikes them. On the other hand, he does make inroads in the world of the arts and in literature and eventually in the movies. There's a very funny episode I recount in my book, Madness in Civilization, where Samuel Goldwyn, the Hollywood producer, reads about Freud and sex and thinks, oh, this is great. I'm going to travel to Vienna and I'm going to bring Freud back to Hollywood and he's going to write scripts for me. So he shows up, waving a check, I think, for $100,000, an immense sum of money, and Freud won't see him, sends him away. Psychoanalysis ends up in Hollywood movies in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and sometimes even later than that. But so Freud in his lifetime is very much a minority taste. What changes is, sadly, after his death from cancer. We all know about shell shock. Yeah. One of the things that produces the idea that under sufficiently traumatic circumstances, even well-adjusted people break down. And that environmental factors then play a major role in the production of mental distress and disturbance. What we don't often realize is that a very similar episode of mass psychosis also occurred in World War II. Among American troops, for example, psychiatric casualties were 2 to 3 times as high in World War II as they had been in World War I. And that's a novel for many people. And it was a problem the military had a very hard time coping with, as they had done in the First Great War. It affected morale. It affected the fighting ability of troops. These people were a thorough nuisance. It was hard to distinguish genuine breakdown from malingering. People who don't wish to have their rear ends shot off could very easily say, and start acting out. So the army had to train people to try and deal with this problem very quickly. And in America, that fell under the man who became Brigadier William Manager, or Bill Manager, from the clinic of that name in the American Midwest, in Kansas. And the treatments that were developed were predominantly what we would call psychotherapeutic. They were heavily imbued with Freudian ideas, modified for the circumstance. And after the war, this had created, when the war opened, America had about 2,500 psychiatrists total. When the war ended, the Army alone had 2,500 psychiatrists, right? And so they'd all been trained very, very rapidly, but they wanted more, and they wanted to go back, and they had decided that mental illness could be treated on an outpatient basis, not necessarily in the mental hospitals. And so after the war, very quickly, psychoanalysis achieved dominance in America that lasted until well into the 1970s, maybe until 1980. And more recently, starting in the 1980s, a sort of anti-Freud critique emerged, and the so-called Freud wars erupted.
Exactly.
And ironically and perversely, I think all that controversy around Freud's work helped keep it alive, because by then, mainstream psychiatry in America and in Britain, come to that, had largely abandoned psychoanalysis and swung back heavily in a biological direction, which is what persists today. It's a complicated picture. I'm sketching in very broad strokes. Freudians saw symptoms as the tip of the iceberg. They were what brought you to them, but they weren't the real problem. And if you tried to suppress the symptoms, it was like playing whack-a-mole. You bang that one down and another symptom would pop up over here. By contrast, clinical psychologists who claim to be guided by work in the laboratory and scientific testing of what worked directed themselves to relatively short-term treatment of symptoms. Symptoms became, as it did for psychiatrists after 1980, the defining characteristic of mental illness. It's how you diagnosed it, how you treated it. And so there's this whole shift in the last 50 years in the way things are conceptualized. And so among psychologists, finding ways to suppress symptoms, which is a great benefit to patients very often, was the holy grail. And cognitive behavioral therapy and various variants of it have become part of the leitmotif of things in the present day. So we have this odd spectacle. Drugs developed in the 1950s and 60s and have become the sheet anchor of psychiatric practice now. One very smart person at Harvard that I like to quote was a man named Leon Eisenberg. And Leon Eisenberg had a very long career. So he lived through the period of Freudian dominance into the period of genetics and neuroscience. And he said, at the outset of my career, what I found was a brainless psychiatry. And at the end of my career, it was a mindless psychiatry, right? Because the Freudians had nothing to do with physiology. And the modern psychiatrist thinks everything's somehow a brain disorder or rooted in your genes. And I think both those extreme positions are a bad mistake. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve in the future. But as I look at things, I see these lurches from one side to the other as profoundly mistaken things and things we need to move away from.
So you've really, we started with the dawn of man and gotten right up to the very biological and...
yes.
Has there been a golden era somewhere here?
Oh, it's interesting you should ask that. There have been various psychiatrists who've tried to point to a golden era, but it's not clear. Unless you share their particular set of beliefs about things, it's hard to say. So those who still remain committed to a psychological model obviously point back to the dominance of psychoanalysis as, to some degree, a golden era. Those committed to a more somatic approach, both see the early 20th century as a period where at last it was recognized that mental illness had a biological component, and turn to the present and say, well, we're moving ever closer to solving these problems. I'm not convinced that's the case. Tom Insel was the head of National Institute of Mental Health, the main governmental organization funding academic psychiatry. And when he stepped down in 2015, he gave an interview and he said, well, you know, I've spent 13 years in this job and I've spent, upwards of $20 billion. And he said, I've funded some very interesting neuroscience, some cool genetics. And he said, none of it has made a whit of difference to the mentally ill. Treatments have not improved. If anything, they've got, things have gone backwards. If you look at suicide rates, you look at life expectancy. Life expectancy for people with serious mental illness is regularly 15 to 25 years less than the rest of us. And there are a lot of complex reasons, factors that go into that. But nonetheless, if we really were advancing in our treatment of serious mental illness, you would not see that picture. No. You would not. No.
So let me get a bit personal, because you started off with saying you spent your life with this, the history of mental health.
So, yes.
Yes. So if you would diagnose yourself, what diagnosis would you give yourself?
I don't know. I think I have, by and large, lived a very fortunate life. And so it's a curious thing that I've devoted so much of my working existence to puzzling about these recalcitrant and very distressing and damaging things. So one of the things I would say to you is that as a lawyer who has himself or herself for a client has a fool for a client, a physician who diagnoses himself or herself is a fool. We don't have enough distance from our own selves. Luckily, I've been spared hallucinations, delusions, major episodes of depression. I haven't been spared grief. I lost one of my children, and there's nothing worse. But that aside, and, that's one of the things that makes me wary of pathologizing grief. I think it is a fact of life. So one learns to cope with grief, or one's life is destroyed by it. That can happen. I saw that with one of my colleagues who's lost his very elderly parents in their 80s and early 90s, and for 2 years was basically rendered incapable of doing his normal job. That's distressing and sad, and that's not healthy.
No.
And these are things that happen all the time.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Andrew Scull.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.